Back.
Huh.
Hey guys, we are live. We are starting in just a minute. We are waiting for Ruth to answer a question. She said both are actually wrong. Luke and I were wrong. I'm eating
Oh,
a donut, one of the best desserts ever.
oh yeah.
So, Luke, there's donuts around somewhere. That's all I know.
Yep. Be downstairs in the kitchen.
Well, all right, guys, welcome to our session this afternoon with Luke Seibert. I am so honored to have Luke with us today and cannot wait to hear what the Lord has given him to speak about for us today. So I'm excited. So, Luke, I'm going to let you present, let you introduce yourself. I'm going to drop down below, but I'm here.
All right. Appreciate it. As Jen said, my name is Luke Seibert, and this afternoon I wanted to share stuff about a dialogue, and that's one area of writing that I felt like I've learned a lot over the past several years. But before I dive into that, I want to give a little bit of background about where I'm coming from. Is that growing up, I did not really enjoy writing. Had to do it for school and did some creative writing, which some of that was fun, but was not something that I felt was a passion of mine or something I ever envisioned myself doing. And then I lost my sight about 6.5 years ago in a car wreck. And then recovering from that, I began to read a lot of Kindle books and just didn't find books that really captured my attention or I thought were good. And just felt prompted, well, if you can't find a story that you like reading, why don't you write one? And I was like, well, okay, I'll start. I don't know if I'll finish a book or not. But as I did, just began to find that I loved writing, telling stories through that, and just kept up with it. And so now I've published six novels, self-published them through Amazon, and have taken take one class with John Scott Bell through the great courses on writing and a few other things, and just love telling stories, and dialogue's a big part of that, and wanted to share that this afternoon. Because dialogue is one of those things which can help drive a story in a subtle way, but when it's done wrong or it can get really cringy pretty quick. So I wanted to share some of the different jobs of dialogue, because dialogue isn't just something we throw into stories just as placeholders or have conversations. It actually serves purposes in the story. And there's several different jobs that it can do, but I want to talk about three this afternoon. And first is character development. Then we'll talk about how it can create tension, and then and then it can also I had something else here. Sorry. Great tension and character development. And so we'll look at some of these each in turn. And some of those were pulled from John Scott Bell and his work. He had others, and there's some other jobs as well that we could look at. But we'll look at it just a few this afternoon. So the first is character development. There's a few ways that we can use dialogue to help us with this, developing our characters and distinguishing them, keeping them straight, because some books have a really big cast of characters, and it can be hard to keep them straight. But one way that we can use dialogue to help with that is giving your characters a pet word or phrase. And it's not something they say in every chapter or in every line, but it's consistent. It comes up regularly. And just a few quick examples that if you've ever read Bleak House by Charles Dickens, there's several memorable characters, but like John Jarndyce, his phrase, "The wind is in the east," just his little pet phrase that he uses when there's tension or he knows something's not going to go right. He says that. Or from, Andy Griffith, Gomer Pyle, in his way, he said Shazam. Or Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot talking about the little gray cells. It's just a common feature. And even in real life, I have several friends who have a particular phrase that is unique to them. That is, wouldn't say it sums them up, but it sets them apart. And it can be the same thing with our characters. Is we can give a few characters a pet word or phrase that is unique to them and that helps set them apart in the reader's mind. And you don't want to necessarily do that to every character. You can overdo it, but it's something that can be worked in with their dialogue. Another way is to give characters distinctive speech, helping them have different vocabulary or maybe different ways of speaking. Some characters may speak with shorter sentences, others longer, but it allows them to kind of almost hear the voice of the character in a distinct way. And you want it to be age and genre specific. In the same book, you don't want the grandfather figure to sound like the teenage girl. You want them to kind of have their own sets of vocabulary, ways of speaking and talking with others. And same thing with genre. That a contemporary fiction novel set in like Manhattan is the characters aren't going to talk like a historical fiction one from like the Reformation in England. There's going to be a distinct set of vocabulary and way of speaking that helps make the story realistic and your characters believable. And that also help, and dialogue also shows what's important to your characters. What are they going to talk about? If something they don't really care about one way or the other, they're not going to constantly keep bringing it up. But if it is something that's important to their heart, that's impressed upon them, it's going to come up in various ways. It may not be expressed in the same way. It may not be a particular phrase they say all the time, but maybe a particular subject that just they keep coming back to and they just can't get away from. And Jesus talked about that in the gospel in Matthew 12. He talks about the mouth speaks from that which fills the heart. That whatever our characters feel deeply about, whatever their passion is, it should come out in their dialogue, should be reflective. And if something's not all that important to them, we don't want it to keep coming up, in every chapter. So those are just a few ways that we can use dialogue to help with character development and to develop this distinctiveness of our characters, show what's important to them, using distinctive speech through vocabulary or sentence structure or shorter, longer sentences, and then maybe giving a few characters a pet word or a pet phrase that is just unique to them, maybe kind of quirky. Like in Bleak House, there's this one character who just refers to himself as a mere child, just a child, a mere child. And it's just kind of a quirky thing that he does that really encapsulates his character. Or it could be a more serious phrase that applies to who they are, encapsulates their character that way. But those are a few ways that we can use dialogue to help us with character development. Another way is that we can use dialogue. Another job of dialogue is creating tension between characters. That tension in stories does not just have to be physical or a physical threat, explosions and gunfire, knife fights. Tension can happen a lot of times just through characters interacting in their dialogue. And John Scott Bell points that out, that he says to use that tension even among friends. And he points out that it can be even something minor. We have those big kind of blow up fights in stories, which the tension's really high and they're just going at each other's throats. In my first book, The Master of My Life, the two characters, Josh and Savannah, they're dating, and Josh is starting to go down this path that his girlfriend wants no part of. And the tension's kind of building for a little while in the relationship until one night it just blows up. And they're just going back and forth, cutting each other off in sentences and just trying to speak over each other. It's a very high tension point. And that having your characters interrupt each other, John Scott Bell says, that's one aspect that helps raise that tension and can create that sense of speed and moving your character, moving through the story fast in a heated argument. Because in real life, we don't wait in an argument. We don't wait for the other person to fully finish their thought, go on for 2 paragraphs to explain themselves before we jump in with our rebuttal or our response. So having your characters go back and forth like that is a way to help create the tension. But it doesn't have to be those big blow up fights in every chapter. It could be something that just maybe gets underneath one of your character's skins, and maybe he just kind of makes an offhanded comment that's a little cynical, or just he just kind of speaks out of frustration. It could be something like that, or it could be even a little more humorous, somewhat picking at each other, kind of creating a little bit of tension, not necessarily conflict, but kind of going back and forth at each other. An example of this is in my most recent book, It's Your Move. There's 2 characters, Jason and Melissa. They're walking down this hallway, and they're in their early 20s, had gone through school together. And so Melissa says, she's telling Jason, what some plans she has coming up. And she said, I'm trying to reconnect with all the guys from high school. And then Jason responds with, just the guys? And she sighed loudly. You know what I mean. Just, it's kind of a joke that comes up later in the story as well. But just something light like that, but still keeping going forward, kind of picking at each other. So you have this various levels of tension that your characters can have through their interactions. Everything from just a simple kind of slightly humorous, picking at each other, to the big confrontation fight, whether it's between two characters who are close to one another, or your antagonist and your hero, whatever it is. You have this spectrum of tension, but dialogue is a helpful way to do that, to help bring another element of tension or conflict into the story, where it's not just a physical difficulty or a physical situation that is creating that conflict. And so we're talking about jobs of dialogue, and we've gone through character development. And a lot of what dialogue helps us to do is to help make our characters distinct, because we're not constantly reminding our readers of what the physical appearance of our characters is. And so dialogue is a way to help make them distinct or unique in our minds and in the reader's minds. It's also as another element of tension and conflict to the story, and it can add depth and various levels of that tension. And the third job I want to talk about, which I'd forgotten earlier, was theme. Is that this is something that is really important, especially like in different novels that aren't necessarily from first person, though it can be done with first person as well, and it is, but in third person, where you don't want to just tell the reader, this is what the story is about, this is the main theme. Let it be developed through dialogue. Let your characters' reactions, and there's various ways that this happens. I'm going to go through a few examples of my favorite ones. And what is from my favorite novel of all time? It's The Visitation by Frank Perret. Just a fantastic story. The story is about this guy, Travis Jordan. He was a pastor for about 15 years and just had a lot of things. And the story picks up when he's stepped down. He's kind of gotten burned out. He stepped down from serving in the church, and he's just kind of holed up in his house. And then this new preacher kid comes to town, is taken over in the church and comes to visit Travis, and is just full of enthusiasm and just telling him everything that's going on. And then he says this line right here. He says, "We're going to take this city for Christ." And Travis just loses it and just starts blowing up at him and says, "Have you even asked this town whether it wants to be taken for Christ?" And that phrase, "we're going to take this city for Christ," or "we're going to take this town for Christ," that comes up multiple times throughout the novel. Through the new pastor said it. Travis himself reflects back as he's looking back to his journey of how he came to where he's at, how he had used the phrase in the past. And then this false Messiah that comes to town, he starts using it. And it helps develop this theme of what it really means to know Christ. We do a lot. We say we're doing this in the name of Christ, but do we really know him? Do we really know what his will is? So that repeated phrase helps drive that theme and bring it to the forefront without, slapping your reader upside the head and saying, they're just spelling it out for them in narrative. Here's what the theme is. It's developed through dialogue. But it doesn't have to be through repeated phrase like that. It could just be a simple aha moment, like a yes, that's it. And it just encapsulates the story in a very subtle way, but is kind of a pinpoint moment you can look back to and say, yeah, that sums it up. Kara Lindenberg does this in her book, A Study in Terminal. And the two characters that in this interaction, you have Sean and his friend Rena. And so Sean's come over. He's found this just pathetic little kitten that he's not going to care for, but he doesn't want to throw it out and leave it on the wayside. So he brings it to his friend Rena, and Rena's really caring for it and is taking it to put it in another place of the house to care for it. And then Sean calls after. He says, "Thank you." And says, Rena laughs. "For what, Sean?" I hesitate. "For loving the outcasts. There aren't many people who do that." And you're like, boom, that's it, because that theme of loving the outcasts is developed throughout the entire story. And it doesn't, Kara doesn't tell you that right at the beginning, but as the story develops, you see that come to the forefront. And in that moment, you're like, yeah, that's it. And that sums it up succinctly. And that developing the theme. So whether it's through a repeated phrase or in a single moment, it just wraps it all up and you're like, yeah, that's it. And so there are other jobs of dialogue, help that could be done. It could be, maybe the last line of a chapter. It's just a cliffhanger. You're like, and just your reader has to keep moving on to find out what happens next. And there are others, but the three that stood out to me, I wanted to share. But we can use dialogue to help with character development. We can use it to help drive tension, add another layer of conflict. and then helping to develop that theme or to bring that theme to the forefront. And in the last few minutes here before we get into the chat, I want to talk briefly about the mechanics of dialogue, about applying this. How do we actually do this? Some things to keep in mind when we're actually writing dialogue with our characters. And this is one of my pet peeves when it comes to dialogue is have your characters talk to one another, not to the reader. That if your characters know each other, they're going to talk like that. Two best friends aren't going to be like talking to each other and one says, hey, Craig, I love it that you're my best friend and we've done everything together since high school. They already know that. But maybe if one of your characters is meeting someone new and is trying to explain, he's like, yeah, Craig's my best friend, man. You should have seen us in high school. We did everything together. Where we're learning along with the characters in the story. That's a way to do it naturally, but not just having them talking to the reader from characters who know each other. An example from a movie that I watched recently was from The Patriot, a story about the American Revolution. You had the main character, Benjamin Martin. He's father of 7 children. He's a member of the Congress there in South Carolina. And the Congress has come together and voting, do we join the Patriots and separate from England, or do we stay? He says, no, I'm not going to vote to go to war. And one of the other officers who's there, who had served with Benjamin during the previous campaign, calls him the hero of Fort Wilderness. And we're like, what is Fort Wilderness? What happened there? And that comes up repeatedly throughout the movie until finally Benjamin explains it to his son, who has heard, his father referred to as hero of Fort Wilderness all his life, and has no clue what it is. But we're learning along with the son, so it's in a natural setting there. So just have your characters talk to one another, not to the reader. They can explain things, but it has to be in a natural way where a character doesn't know something previously and is learning it, and we're learning with the character there. Another real quick thing to talk about is using proper tags with our dialogue to help make sure our readers are tracking with us about who's talking. And dialogue tags are helpful with that, but also use action tags. Action tags help us to engage the theater of the reader's mind, as Jerry Jenkins talks about, where your reader is seeing the conversation that is going on. This is especially true if you've got 2 characters sitting in a booth of like a coffee shop. There's not a whole lot of movement going on, but it can be subtle. Maybe a character scratches her chin. Maybe he averts his eyes. Just something like that where you're seeing your characters interact with each other. Maybe facial expressions. There's a lot of ways to do that. But your action tags do help bring that element of vividness to your story and allowing your reader to see in their mind's eye what's going on. But when we use action tags, and this is one thing I did not know when I started writing, was separate the dialogue from the action tag. So, if your dialogue comes first, end it with a period, not a comma, and then begin the action tag with the capital, because they're 2 separate sentences and distinguish in that way. But yeah, use action tags. Action tags are helpful and definitely help bring that element of realism to the story. And then the last little technique I want to bring about is to know when to condense. That you don't have to spell out every conversation that your characters have. That if it's not relevant to the plot or to that part of the story, consider condensing it, shortening it, kind of summarizing it. Books, maybe you have your 2 characters that, they exchange greetings or something like that. You don't have to them going, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm good. How about you? You don't have to always include that in there, especially if there's a lot of coming and going that can get tedious, and your reader can get like, okay, I don't want to hear this about the kind of small talk. Get to it. You could say that your characters they exchange greetings and small talk until John snapped his fingers and said, right, so about that text you sent me last week, and then you can get into the meat of what that conversation is. Why are they even having that conversation in that part of the story? With condensing it so you can focus on what's most important. And so those are just some techniques that we can use with dialogue to helping keep it flowing smoothly and to keep your readers engaged where they don't get pulled out of the story. And there's that element of realism where your characters are speaking to one another. And so dialogue is an extremely important part of telling stories. And John Scott Bell says that, dialogue is a tool, a weapon, a way for your characters to get what they want. That it doesn't have to just be a placeholder or just something we have to throw in just to try to fill up space. That it performs jobs. 3 of those jobs are helping us to develop our characters, showing what's important to them, and also helping to distinguish different characters, maybe through a pet word or phrase, or through a particular way of speaking, through vocabulary or sentence structure. Make your dialogue work for the story and to help develop those characters. It also works by helping to create another layer of tension and conflict in the story, whether from an intense argument and confrontation to maybe a more minor to a more like minor, just kind of picking at each other, just maybe as friends do, or maybe even a misunderstanding, something they're not really angry with each other, but one character misunderstands the other, and that creates this element of conflict that comes out through dialogue. And then dialogue also helps to develop that theme, and it can be slow and gradual, and maybe through a way of particular phrases used by multiple characters over the book, or through that maybe just one aha moment where you can just tell as you're reading, yeah, that encapsulates it. That's the theme. And so those are a few of the jobs that dialogue does. And then techniques, there are a lot of resources out there you can check into about like either punctuation, making sure that's right, and then just try to be realistic with the dialogue. Having your characters speak to one another. If they know each other, have them speak like that. And if they're just kind of meeting each other and try to learn about one another, yeah, we can learn along with the characters, but just make it realistic to the particular setting and the situation there. And then to know when to condense where we don't bog the reader down with unnecessary details, where we keep the story moving forward and keep them engaged. You want them to keep turning stories, keep turning chapters to carry on the story. And so, yeah, use dialogue. You can use these techniques and the others. There's a lot of resources out there, but effective dialogue can bring a vividness and a punch to your story to keep your reader engaged all the way through.
Wonderful, wonderful, Luke. All right, guys, we have had this chat, Luke, blowing up since the very beginning. Talking about your tips that you're sharing, bringing out points, asking questions. So I would love to start with our questions, and I'm going to go back to earlier ones when it first started. Like you started getting questions at like 2:37. Wow. Awesome, Luke. And you can continue to drop your questions in the chat, questions, comments. Please list them, and I'm going to go back. So, Luke, are you ready for me to fire them away?
Yep. That's good.
Okay, so Haley was on Facebook on her chat part, and she said, let words or phrases to establish a character. That's a great tip. So she liked what you were presenting there, and now has a question for you. Do you have any tips for how to come up with one for a particular word or phrase? I've been trying to come up with something from one of my MCs. I haven't been able to come up with anything because the story is set in 1607 in another country. So you can't be modern or American. Do you have any tips there?
Think about something that would be unique to that particular character. Another one of my favorite books is That Printer of Udell's. I forget who wrote it, but it's an older book. But there's this one character in there, and he's kind of a reoccurring thing, just kind of unique about him, is that he smokes a pipe, but his wife gets on to him. And so he says, okay, I'll stop. But when he does, he's like, I get so plagued. There's one particular phrase that he says about it that he just kind of expresses his frustration. That is his sort of unique phrase, but it's unique to him because of his situation with trying to please his wife, but wanting to keep on to that thing that kind of brings him comfort. And it doesn't really drive the plot, but it's just unique to him. And so just think about that. Like in Bleak House again, there's another character, Miss Flight, and she keeps talking about the Day of Judgment. It's unique to her, and she's waiting for this court case to end that is unique to her situation. She's kind of equated it in her mind to the final judgment at the end of time, and she keeps talking about waiting for her judgment to come in, or the Day of Judgment. And it's her unique phrase based on her situation. So I guess I try to look at your character, what's unique about them, maybe some of their struggles or something that would seem natural for them to say.
And their situation.
Yeah.
So when then you're thinking of time period, it could be something like an idea generation, like we had in an earlier session, Haley, where you're trying to look at things from different perspectives, or you're taking a common object and you're putting it in a phrase.
Mm.
So something may be common to that time period, and a phrasing technique might be one that you could consider brainstorming over too. So
Yeah. So like in that printer of Udell's, so this is older time period when they were still using the printer and press. And there's one of the secondary characters runs the printing shop. And he has this phrase that he says, just an exclamation. He says, "Great shade of the immortal Benjamin Franklin." Or he might condense it, "The great shade of the immortal Benjamin F." He just kind of shorts it, but he's the only one who uses that phrase. But it's unique to him because with Benjamin Franklin, with the printing press, and that was unique to his own situation, his job that he was doing, but fit that time period.
oh, love it. So then you can maybe bring something up from the 1400s, 1500s that could reference back, Haley,
Yeah.
kind of look back in those as taking that as a cue. So I love that. All right, let's go on. Lila said, a few times I have done distinctive words for a character, but most often I forget to use this. After having recorded my own audiobooks, I realize how important it is for the written word.
Yeah.
So yep, Lila is reiterating that importance. All right, I'm scrolling all down. Okay. Oh, Lila said, maybe I missed it, but what genre does Luke write in? And I was kind of giving some of the chat, but I was like, I'm going to let Luke go because I did contemporary Christian, historical fiction, middle grades. So, Luke, you take it away because this is you.
Yeah. So I write in a variety. My contemporary fiction is set in rural Alabama where I live. And then my historical fiction, I did a trilogy about the American Civil War, and then that's mostly what I've done. But doing some work, hopefully for some books to come out next year about the Maccabean Revolt. So it's another period of historical fiction. A lot of the historical fiction I do is drawn more towards more of a physical conflict, like with a war or something like that. And then those are the two main genres that I keep going back and forth between.
And then middle grades. Let's not.
Yes. Yeah, that's also a contemporary fiction, though, for middle grade, also set in rural North Alabama. Kind of an adventure inspired by a few camping trips that I had been on.
And let's talk about songwriting.
Yeah, I have toyed around a little bit with songwriting. I haven't done some in a little bit, but somewhat more of like a modern hymn style, like if you're familiar with like the Gettys, really inspired by them, and also a little bit of bluegrass. Those two other genres of songwriting that I've played around with some, but it's been a little bit since I've done that.
Okay, we have another question from Lila. She said, I know this isn't the focus of this session, but I'm really curious about Luke's process while being blind. How do you revise or edit? Do you use AI audio?
Yeah, in a way. I use a screen reader program like NVDA or JAWS. And so there's commands I can use to the keyboard that allows me to be able to read back through what I've written. And I can just use arrow keys to get to the particular part that I want to. And I can just edit it. And as I'm editing it, reads back to me the changes that I've made. So I get my book done as best I can for myself. And then I print it off and give it to some of my sighted family members. I'm like, hey, what did I miss? Is this particular paragraph, is it centered when it should be left justified? And just some things that maybe I've missed that allow them to help go back with the more fine-tooth comb and help finish up with the editing.
So Ruth, speaking of family, she said, trusting the reader. That's a great point. Throughout our comments today, people have been shouting out great tips, great points today, and takeaway that we do trust our reader, because you said this is one thing, the pet peeve. Don't.
Yeah.
And then later on in the chat, Ruth is going, we've had dialogue about this.
Yeah.
Dialogue about what you guys think about giving too much or not enough in characters, but absolutely love it. And Ruth said, love those cliffhanger dialogue pieces, because if she has time to continue reading, she will. So
Yeah. And that's one thing I like with having your characters talk to one another and trusting your reader is that you don't have to explain everything that's new right up front. That there can be keep your reader in somewhat of a suspense, like and pull them in and be like, I want to know more about that. What are they talking about? And then you need to follow up on that promise. Explain to your reader later. I think Jerry Jenkins talked about that, but you can keep your reader a little bit in suspense without having to explain everything right up front.
And that's Rachel Clark was like tension. Like she made a comment about how that tension is important and it can work that way.
Yeah.
Women of the Northwest podcast is here. And she said, Luke, your talk and points are spot on. Thanks.
Thank you.
So there we go. Spot on. That's her phrasing. She might use that word a lot when she's with people and dialogue. Yep. We all have our quirks when we speak too.
We do. Yeah.
And it's listening to others and picking up on that can also help you write authentic dialogue for your characters.
Mm-hmm.
So, Luke, we want to thank you. Rachel said, thanks. Great presentation. Ruth said, great job, Luke. Lila, this has been so great, Luke. Thank you. Tish, that was an awesome presentation. So, Luke, we want to thank you so much for sharing with us today at the WWJ conference on your knowledge of dialogue and how we can make it work effectively in our stories. So thanks so much, Luke.
All right. Thank you.
All right, guys, we're signing off. And at 3:15, Ashley White was not able to be with us today. And we're just so thankful that Ann Harrison has picked up the torch. We're running in the Olympic Games on this day. And she has grabbed it and is now taking the lead for us at 3:15 in like an hour's notice. So I want to thank Ann for graciously agreeing to do that. And we will see you back in 15 minutes. All right, Luke, thank you.
All right, thanks.